Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in today's video we're going to talk about another argument for God's existence that's called the ontological argument. Ontological. Not biological, not zoological, ontological. So let's just go ahead and say it. This is going to not make any sense, especially if you've never heard it before. It's one of those arguments, it's to show that God must exist. And when you first hear it, you're almost certainly going to think that it's the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your life. And it's one of those things that's actually a really good argument. I can say for myself, my own testimony about myself, I thought this was a terrible argument. I was like, this is the worst argument I've ever heard. It's actually a really good argument, but it is difficult to understand how it works. It seems like a lot of these arguments you hear for God's existence, people hear them, and even if they don't agree with them, they do at least feel smart for not agreeing with it, and like they've accomplished something, and like they've got this great defeater for that, the Kalam argument, or for the moral argument, or something like that. But with this argument, people don't even almost tripped there. People don't even feel smart for. They're like, what is that? That's like if I told you, hey everybody, let's go collect all the cow manure we can and have that for supper tonight. You would just be like, oh, So anyway, let's look at the word ontological. Is a philosophical term. It's distinct from epistemological, episteme versus ontos. So ontology in philosophy is the study of what is, and then epistemology is the study of how we know what is. So epistemology is the study of like how we know things, how we can know things, and ontology is the study of like what is. And there's two. There is actually an ontological and epistemological difference, which is not really that important for this argument. Let's really get into the craziness. So this argument has a pretty clear origin. Originates with this guy in the Middle Ages named Anselm, and often referred to as Saint Anselm, made a saint after his death. Little known extra fact, he was one of the major people that preached against slavery, railed against it in the name of Christ, at a time in the middle of the Middle Ages when they abolished slavery in Europe and shifted to the feudal system. Another point for another time. Anselm was he knew that there were all these different arguments and proofs for things that Christians believed in. He was trying to unify it. And I think 100 years later, or is it 200 years later, there was this other guy named Thomas Aquinas who wrote the Summa Theologica. It's like this big long thing of all these different arguments and theological reasoning. It tried to cover everything. And it's like huge. And then at the very onset of the Middle Ages, you've got this guy Augustine, who I think we have like 10 million or 15 million of his words handed down to us. I mean, I'm in the midst of trying to listen to the audiobook of Augustine's City of God. He goes through arguments for God's existence that they had back in Augustine's day around 400 AD. His point, he said, if you don't believe that God has a plan for your life and is concerned about your life, then Plato's argument to prove that, he said you're an insane person if you don't believe it, if you don't understand Plato's argument for that, But arguments for God's existence, and this is an important thing I'm trying to introduce you to, is they develop over time. They change. They're not static. They sometimes a weakness is shown, and sometimes they're shown to be stronger. So we're going to start off with the version of the argument that Anselm gave us, and then we're going to move through history and see why people rejected it, and then we're going to come back and see how people came back and went back to what he originally said and tried to say basically the same thing, but say it in a more difficult to escape way. But essentially Anselm's idea was that, like, all right, here's Anselm, and he says that, in his mind is an idea of God, and because the idea of God exists in his mind, then God must exist. Oh, God always has a beard, right? In the actual world. Real. So because God exists in his mind, God must exist in the actual world. That's incredibly... So that is like the ridiculously watered down version of Anselm's argument. And one thing you can do, Anselm stated it better than that, but one thing you can do with these arguments, and a lot of times you'll run into, is atheists and other people too will take your arguments and modify them into like a watered down version that's easy to refute. So like, if that was the argument, God exists as an idea in my mind, so therefore he exists in the real world, like, you'd be like, okay, that's the worst argument I've ever heard. That's not, it's like $1 billion. Here's my wallet. There's, I bet you there's like $20 bills in this wallet. Let's look. Nope. There's like a few ones, 120. No, there's no. I don't see any $100 bills, much less 200 $100 bills. So most of us are used to the idea that, like, just because something exists in my mind, it doesn't exist in reality. Anselm's version of the argument was, stronger than that, but what he was saying was like, we can put it like this. He didn't mean that anything that he thinks of that exists in his head must also exist in reality, but that a greatest being exists in his mind and therefore would have to exist in reality. Because what he's saying is, if the being is truly the greatest being, then it can't only exist in his mind, it must also exist in reality. So if God exists in his mind and his ideas, but to exist in reality too would be greater. So God of the mind is greater, we can put it this way, is not, wait, got it backwards there. God of the mind is not as great as God in reality. And so, since the God that exists in his mind is the idea of the greatest possible being, then he says it can only be the greatest possible being if it exists in reality too. And this is Anselm's argument. So there you go. He said it in more words than that, but that's the super watered down version of it. We won't spend a real long time on it. So that's Anselm's argument. So we fast forward to an Enlightenment era thinker, late 1700s, early 1800s, a guy named, I don't know when exactly Immanuel Kant lived, 1700s. Immanuel Kant, a name written large over history. As I understand it, if you use the word phenomenon as part of the common English language parlance today, it's because this guy's philosophical ideas. Sometimes a lot of Christians use Immanuel Kant. I remember I read, let me see, get this book. This is a book I read a long time ago called Dinesh D'Souza, What's So Great About Christianity. I read this like forever ago. Man, it was probably like 2005, 2006. The pages are kind of yellow. I was blown away in that book because he used Immanuel Kant's ideas to say that, like, you can't really know anything for sure, so it was like, therefore it's okay for him to be a Christian, and if anyone asks him for proof, he doesn't have to give it, you know. It was like, because Kant tried to critique pure reason on the basis of he said there's good arguments for and against the beginning of the universe, so therefore you can't learn anything from logic. I don't think you can logically critique pure reason, and I think that was a problem with what Kant said. I'm not super familiar with everything Kant said, but I am familiar with what he said about the ontological argument. So, what Kant's point, and this is a point I agreed with, and when I heard Anselm's argument the first time, I was like, I don't agree with that. And I couldn't lay my finger on why, and then I realized why, and then I found out that Immanuel Kant had 200 years before me said the exact same thing that I was thinking, and I was like, yeah, Kant's my guy. So I was like, Kant's point is like this: is that it's, if you can imagine a bunch of money that is supposed to be coins, a stack of coins. Well, that's terrible. Let's try it. We'll just do it like this. If you can imagine a bunch of money in your mind, and then there's also money in reality. So, Kant's point is that the money in your mind, the idea of the money, so here's a quarter, here's some change, that this is not in my mind. His point is that the idea of money in the mind is a total, it does not equal the real money. So what he's saying is that the idea of money exists in my mind, but any properties that it has do not apply to it in the real world, because the idea of money and the real money are two totally separate things. And so what he's saying is you can have an idea of a greatest conceivable thing without that thing actually being the greatest conceivable thing, you know, and that sort of thing. So that's Kant's famous refutation of the ontological argument, which, for me, that refuted it. The other refutation is, I'll just put it like this. The greatest, there's a bunch of different versions of it, but the greatest conceivable pizza. You know, so I can, in my mind, I can imagine the greatest conceivable pizza. The greatest pizza that could possibly exist. And because it exists in my mind, it must therefore exist in reality. And these are called parity arguments against Anselm's ontological argument for God's existence. Well, the parity arguments, the question that the problem with these parity arguments, like, okay, well, the way it works is like this. What's a greater pizza? A pizza that's powerless, or a pizza that has power to do things? More powerful pizza is greater. And so you begin to see that, like, this only really applies to God. The whole idea of the greatest conceivable thing, the greatest conceivable entity, whatever that is, it would have to have the greatest level of morality. It would have to have the greatest level of power, the greatest level of knowledge, you know, the greatest level of beauty, the greatest level of strength, the greatest level of pleasure, the greatest level of love, you know, whatever great making quality, it would have to be. And so I immediately understood that this whole parity argument, that fails. And I got that. But what we're talking about is what philosophers traditionally call a maximally great being. There must be a maximally great being, or you could just say a maximally great entity. You know. But then you realize that, like, you know, is a human being, you know, is a being that possesses love and honesty and compassion greater than a rock. Yeah, so it would have to be a greatest conceivable being. And so you begin to say, okay, so this is like an idea of God that's not really coming from the Bible. It's just based on what's called theological theism, that just like you can philosophically derive that there must be a maximally great being or entity, a being of maximal greatness that essentially has all great-making properties maxed out. So like anything that exists has properties that make it what it is. That's the law of identity, the first law of reason. So this book has properties that make it what it is. This marker has different properties that make it, that's why it's not the same thing as a book. You can say properties, or you can just say a definition of what it is. And for something to exist, there has to be a set of propositions that spell out exactly what it is. We may not know what all of those propositions are. We may only know some of those propositions. Of course, with God, there's no way we could know all of those propositions, or we would know everything God knows. And with anything that exists, we don't ever know all of the propositions that make it what it is. But we do know that for it to exist, it must have an identity. It must have properties. Okay. So anyway, but Immanuel Kant's objection fails too. And one of the reasons that this argument about God, the ontological argument, is hard to wrap our minds around is that it really only applies to God. A maximally great being is the only thing that this argument really applies to. And so we run into this problem of it's hard to wrap your mind around it. It's only a proof for God's existence and that sort of thing. It's confusing, So along comes the 20th century, and in the 20th century, atheism basically had historically throughout the university and throughout basically smarty pants people thought, any hard-nosed intellectuals, since the Enlightenment, sort of atheism had been on the rise, and it had risen through every department, science departments, sociology departments, psychology departments, medical, everything had slowly become more and more atheist. And philosophy was one of the bedrocks of atheism, philosophy, and that's no way, it is the department that had long banished the Almighty, right? The theology departments were the last ones to start saying that God doesn't exist. So you start getting theology departments had been saying it for a while, but you get the famous divinity schools at Harvard and Yale finally saying that God doesn't exist, But we believe in God as a symbolic concept, that still is important to believe in the way that you believe in Luke Skywalker. It's well, okay, then your religion is the same as me watching a movie, watching Star Wars, going to church and watch Star Wars, the same thing. Yep, that's what they mean. Okay. So people tend to not go to liberal churches. Why get dressed up to go to watch Star Wars? Maybe some people like to take Star Trek that seriously, but usually that's people that think Star Trek is our future because it's supposed to be our future. Now, whatever. If Star Trek future is going to happen, I think World War III is supposed to happen sometime soon, and then we're going to develop warp drive technology in the aftermath. And there were eugenics wars that happened back in the 90s. That didn't happen in the 90s. But anyway. So then things flipped around. And this is a point that William Lane Craig always brings up. He says, atheism had been on the rise until finally in the 1950s it had really come of age, and the theology departments in these universities had started to banish the belief in God. And then he said in the 1960s, it was a mind-blowing thing happened. God became very, very strong in the philosophy departments. And one of those key philosophers is a guy by the name of Alvin Plantinga. Alvin Plantinga. He reformulated the ontological argument. And remember, the ontological argument is incredible. What it says is like, if the idea of God is even possible, if you can even conceive of a concept of God, then God must exist. So it's not, this goes beyond like, that's why it's called ontological, because it's just, it's moving directly to reality. You know, it's not like cosmological arguments say the world exists, so therefore God exists. You know, moral arguments, for example, say we have a sense of good and evil, and that sense we can't have that unless God gave it to us. Well, the ontological argument just says that, like, if the idea of God is even possible, then God must exist. Okay. Well, I mean, it's not really all that debatable, the idea of God. And so, this is fascinating. And Alvin Plantinga's argument, he's still alive. He's a professor at Notre Dame. I've listened to one of his audiobooks. It's great. Listened to it multiple times. It's about the conflict between science and religion. It's called Where the Conflict Really Lies. Great book. Very much philosophy type stuff. Older guy. Very deep voice when he talks. He makes jokes about comic books all the time and football. But so anyway, Alvin Plantinga's point, he talks about something called possible worlds. And so the idea of possible worlds is key in how he sort of stated Anselm's original idea in a way that's more difficult to get around. So he strengthened the original argument. He didn't really create a new argument. He just sort of reformulated it, said it better. Said it where it's hard to. It's the bread and butter of philosophy, is to come up with an argument that you just can't get around. And hopefully about something important. So anyway, possible worlds, it's not the idea in physics of like a multiverse of like parallel universes, or like in comic books and stuff. No, that's not that's not it at all. Possible worlds means like, I'll draw these little earths. It just means worlds where there's no logical problem. Okay? There's no problem logically. That it is possible that world could exist. We don't know if it does or not, but it's just logically possible. So like, so for example, it's logically possible there's a world where you are the president. There's a world where you are Tyrannosaurus Rex. There's a world where you are Superman. There's a world where you don't exist at all. There's a world where you live in the wild, wild west. Okay? Maybe the Tyrannosaurus Rex, I don't know. So there are things that are like scientifically impossible. Like we'll use Superman as an example. Lois Lane falls off the building. And she's going to splat on the pavement. And Superman comes in and he catches her. And it's like he catches her after she's fallen from the top of this skyscraper. And she's like right here. And Superman comes in and catches her and flies her away. And he cradles her a little bit. It's like, okay, if he catches her, if he brings her to a dead stop right there before she hits the concrete, the problem is his arms would be as hard as the concrete to her. Unless, of course, he just lets her fall all the way down. So, like, there's a deceleration. And they even talk about this in the famous Spider-Man comic where the Green Goblin, so like the Spider-Man comic's like, how's it go? So Peter Parker needs to like be with Gwen Stacy because she's the right woman for him, but there's this like female model who's trying to steal Peter Parker away named Mary Jane. It's like Spider-Man in the 70s. And Peter's a scientist and Gwen Stacy's a scientist. Well, meanwhile, the Green Goblin, who's a Joker ripoff, finds out Peter's secret identity and is doing all this, like, it's like all these creepy suppers they're having where he like knows, I know your true identity, you know, and there's like these inside jokes and stuff, and it's like creepy. But eventually Peter realizes, like, you know, that like he loves Gwen Stacy and she's the one he's supposed to be with, you know, and all that. And he finds out the Green Goblin knows his secret identity, knows all that, and has been scheming everything to like mess with Peter Parker and Spider-Man, because this is enemy. So like he finds out that Gwen Stacy is being held at the George Washington Bridge, and Spider-Man just gets there at the last second, and the Green Goblin throws her off the bridge, and Spider-Man shoots his webs, his spider web down to catch her, but she's so close to the ground that he catches her, and she's only like 4 feet off the ground, and so her back cracks just from his spider web. And that's the point I'm making. Okay, I guess I've deliberated that point for a long time. But I'm trying to illustrate a point about science, that it is scientifically impossible for Lois Lane or Gwen Stacy to survive that fall. And Spider-Man can't catch her, Superman can't. In Superman 1, he catches Lois Lane like that. That's a scientific impossibility. But it's not a logical impossibility, because, well, the laws of physics are such that, you know, put it in a crude sense, force equals mass times acceleration. So if Lois Lane is going to be picking up speed as she falls, then she's going to be going pretty fast when she gets to the concrete, and the concrete isn't very soft, so it will decelerate her generally in about 1/10 of a second. It'll bring her to a dead stop in a 1/10 of a second. So she's going to experience an acceleration that goes from, you know, possibly, you know, many miles per hour. In a 1/10 of a second, she's going to go to 0 miles per hour. And you multiply that times how much she weighs, and that's going to be how much force she experiences. And then, as an engineering concept, the force she experiences will be delivered based on how, if she's real spread out when she hits the concrete, then it will be spread all over her whole body. But more likely than not, one part of her body will hit the concrete and take the brunt of the blow and slow her down. And so it's stress, which is signified with sigma, equals force per unit area. You know, just like the way that a knife, if I was to try to force my hand through cheese, it would be a lot harder than if I used a knife, because the knife decreases the force per unit area. So these are all scientific and engineering principles. And I'm trying to belabor that it's very important for us to understand that when we're talking about logically possible worlds, they don't matter. This is a key point. Laws of science, they don't matter. They don't matter. Because you can imagine another world where force equals mass times acceleration times 0.75. So it could, on this Earth, it could be our Earth, and F could equal ma. And then on this Earth, F could equal ma times 0.75. Maybe on Superman's Earth, the laws of force and physics of motion work differently. There's no logically necessary reason why they have to be that way. The reason we think the laws of science are what they are is because we come up with them and then we go out and test them. So Einstein said that when there's a solar eclipse, the gravitational force of the moon will actually bend space, and it will bend it by just this much, and he predicted it out to like 4 decimal places or something. How much space will be bent, and so therefore, as the light comes off the sun around the moon, we can measure how much that light is bent, because as it goes through space, the space itself is bent. So it's traveling through bent space relative to us. And so we confirm Einstein's theory of general relativity with our observations. But there's no logically necessary reason why that it could have, the laws of science could have been different. And so that's what I was trying to demonstrate to you with all this stuff about drop in Lois Lane, and those are laws of science, but they're not a mathematical requirement. But there are some things that would have to be true for all logically possible worlds, or it's usually just said as possible worlds in philosophy. There are some things that would just have to be true for all those worlds. So it doesn't matter what possible world you live in. If you do your equation and you say 3 times 12, that's going to give you 36. And so, it might be F equals MA here, it might be F equals MA times 0.75 here, or it might be some other equation in some other world, but the actual mathematics are the same. 2 equals 2, 2 plus 2 equals 4 in every possible world. So this is the key. This is a key point for you to understand. There is no possible world where 1 plus 1 equals anything other than 2. Okay? Any logically possible world, 1 plus 1 must equal 2 in those worlds. So, therefore, this is Anselm's point. For the real world to exist in reality, it must be a logically possible world. So therefore, if it equals it in all possible worlds, then therefore it must be that must be the case in the real world. Okay? So you can say that there is no logically possible world where 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2. It's true for all possible worlds. Therefore, it must also be true for the real world, because the set of possible worlds must include the real world. Okay? Now, and this is, Anselm's reformulation of it. He says there must be some possible world where God exists. Okay? And what he's saying is that there is a logically possible world where God does in fact exist. And so he's not saying God exists in my mind, but he's saying there must be some logically possible world where God exists. Well, if God exists in some logically possible world, then God must exist in all logically possible worlds. And one of those must be the real world. Because, remember, God is a maximally great being. And so, a condition of maximal greatness, you could ask yourself, a God who only existed in one possible world, would that be as great as a God that would exist in all possible worlds? Nope, it would have to be one that exists in all possible worlds. And so, therefore, the existence of God is as certain as 1 plus 1 equals 2. I kid you not. It's not something that you observe, but you can observe it. You can, you can observe it empirically if you wish. So I can, here we go. Alright, so 1 quarter, 2 quarters, a nickel too, a penny, a dime, Alright, you get the point. So, it's just intrinsic to everything that exists. It's not just a matter, it's like to say that, well, I just know God exists because I just know. There's no, it's not something that you prove with, going out and looking for proof. Okay, it's not like you're a crime scene investigator and you look under a rock and you found out that, there it is, the proof, the evidence, One of my favorite pieces of crime scene investigation I have to do oftentimes on the job is, did I break that? Or who broke this? And one way you can tell if it was broken by me or if I bumped something is you can see if it's a piece of metal, is there rust on the part where it broke? Because I didn't break it and then it immediately rusted, or that would be some evidence, or is there a pile of dirt and mud that's obviously been sitting there for a long time, and there's a fresh, clean cut that you can tell what's going on, and you can find the evidence that way. But this isn't like that at all. You don't go out and look for evidence that 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's just kind of like obvious. Okay, so just as certain as that there's no possible world where 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, or which is one of Alvin Plantinga's. This isn't one that he says, but this is like something he would say. He'll say that President Donald Trump weighs more than the number 7. Or the way he would put it is, there is no possible world where President Donald Trump weighs more than the number 7. Because that's a meaningless statement. The number 7 doesn't really have weight like that. You get the idea. Okay, so there is no possible world where a maximally great being doesn't exist. Okay, so now that we can move on past the existence question, this brings us to the theological theism questions. It's like, okay, then there must exist a being of maximal greatness, which means it has all great making properties are maxed. That there can be no greater being, basically. So maximally great means that there is no way to make the great making properties greater. So this gets very interesting. One point of difference is, and we can make a comparison with Islam versus Christianity, and we can actually show that Islam has a different concept of God from the one in Christianity. Islam and Christianity are very similar. If they were any more similar on their view of Jesus, it would just have to be a different sect of Christianity. But they are different enough on Jesus to say that that's definitely not Christianity. So they revere Jesus just about as much as you possibly can without being a Christian. Okay, but their view of God is a God that, He doesn't expect perfection. He has a very specific list of rules. If you obey them, you go to heaven. If you disobey, you go to hell. But, He doesn't expect perfection from people. Whereas the Christian God is one sin equals hell forever. So which God has the maximally great standard of righteousness? Christian God. Christian God got that, obviously. Okay. Well, the Muslim God will forgive you, but not if you go too long with your sins without getting back right. So it's forgiveness to a point. Only so far. Christian God will forgive you as long as you want it, unless basically the idea is, if you make up your mind you don't ever want forgiveness, then that's your choice. But other than that, it's up to you. So, unconditional. Just as long as you want it. Forgive. So, the Christian God forgives unconditionally. So, is forgiveness and mercy a great making property? Yes. Then the Christian God is greater. So, the Christian God must exist. Because it's clearly that the maximally great being, the being of maximal greatness, must be the Christian God. It certainly takes righteousness more seriously. And it doesn't even matter. It's important. You don't even have to know if your version of greatness is correct. You just have to have a internally coherent definition of greatness. Because the thing is, all you have to do is have the idea of God. Right? Maybe on specific points like forgiveness there's room for debate, but a being of maximal greatness. Yeah, you get the point. Let's see. This is where it gets interesting. So Plantinga's argument's actually really strong, and in philosophy, in the university, no one really disagrees with the reasoning of the possible worlds and the greatest conceivable being. The point of disagreement from professors and everyone who disagrees with him is on that first world. What they say is there is no world, no possible world where God exists. That is the argument that you get back at Alvin Plantinga. That the idea of God is internally illogical and impossible. And so therefore God doesn't exist in, but they agree with Plantinga that if a maximally great being existed in any possible world, then it must exist in the total set of all worlds. They agree with him on that. And then therefore God would have to exist in the real world. The debate with Plantinga is over whether or not there's any possible world where God exists. So in other words, what they're saying is there is no idea of God. That is the primary refutation against Plantinga's argument. That's how strong his argument is. They have to go to the length of saying there's no such thing as the idea of God. So I mean, think about it. Like, if God exists just even as a concept in your mind, then God must exist. It's as solid as 1 + 1 = 2 as, it's incredible, okay? That, Donald Trump doesn't weigh more or less than the number 7. Alright, so that's a pretty extreme point. And the way they defend that point is they say, this is a classic argument. I remember I had a friend who, he got into, online dating. And the girl, this was bad. She talked to him on the phone or something for a year. I don't know what happened. I heard what people told me. That's not always true. But then it was like she was married to somebody else or something. I don't know. What I know for sure is that he had a bad experience. That much I know. And afterwards, he seemed really, I can't think of the right word. He didn't really believe in the whole idea of romance anymore. He thought romance was nonsense. It wasn't his thing. And he kept making this argument. And this argument against God's existence it's called the ontological argument against the existence of God. Everybody's using the word ontological. Well, my point is people use that argument against other stuff too. So he said, you can't define romance. That's what he kept saying. That it got kind of annoying. I know he's going through a hard time, and he was talking about it all the time. You can't define romance, therefore it doesn't exist. And there's a point to that. Some things are a meaningless concept, like a married bachelor is a meaningless concept, so it doesn't exist. In some of my other videos, we talked about an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object is a meaningless concept, therefore it doesn't exist. An actual infinite number of things is a meaningless concept, or it's not meaningless in and of themselves, but if it exists in the actual world, then other meaningless things would have to happen, so it can't exist. And they would have to be possible. Well, that was what he was saying about romance. I remember a different time someone made this similar argument to me, but I kind of heard it because of my friend. But I remember there was this kind of crazy guy came to my church, and he kept claiming that he was God and that he didn't need clothes or to eat food because God was sitting on his head, and that he could see it, and that we all, and I just kind of let him go and explain it to me for a while. And there was this youth minister guy there, and I had to actually tell him, be quiet. He kept wanting to interrupt and argue every little point. And I was like, no, just let the guy talk. you know. And so I let the guy talk, and at that point, the youth minister guy, like, he realized, like, oh, this dude's crazy. He thought it was like, these were like serious religious debates. I was like, no, this isn't serious. This dude's a kook, you know. Like, he thinks he doesn't need to eat or wear clothes, you know, because God's sitting on his head. But like, and we all have that, and we just can't see it like he can, you know. Okay. But like, I just let the guy go. I'm not gonna just say, you know, what up with you. I let the guy talk for a while, and then I said, so you're saying you're a God? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, have you done anything wrong? Have you ever done anything wrong? Because God wouldn't do anything wrong. And so I thought I was getting kind of ready for him to argue with me about who God really is. But instead he went for this. He said you can't define God. And I'd heard that before. I was like, oh, that again. And I knew about it with Alvin, because this is the response people make to Alvin Plantinga. So crazy people will be philosophers a lot of times. The problem with crazy people is they think they're the only philosophers in the world. There's this one youth pastor I know, and he seems to think he's the only philosopher who ever lived, and he does a little bit of philosophical reasoning, and then that's all he needs to know, and he's refuted everyone. And he doesn't realize that like people have written mountains of books on these topics and have spent their lives dedicated to arguing back and forth. And you can't just like think about it for like an hour or so, and then you've got all straightened out. You know, like I was like, what? You know, well, yeah, I've heard this before. This is talked about in the university. This is the ontological argument against the existence of God. This kid was making it to prove that he didn't have to eat or wear clothes. And you know, my friend was talking about it to say that there's no point in ever dating anyone, never love, never, you know. Okay, so the problem with this argument is something I already talked about, if you remember before. This book has certain properties that make it what it is. The pages are a little bit yellow because it's old. The marker has certain properties. A definition. And it's a simple point. You don't have to know everything about something to know something about it. Because the bottom line is, with God would be indescribable, but not completely indescribable. We know something about God. It's not as though we know nothing. We know nothing about God. No. We know something about God, but we don't fully comprehend God. Or you can think of it this way. We know some parts of the definition of God, or we know some of God's properties, but we don't know all of God's properties. And so, do you have a full and complete definition of God? Of course not. And what I told the crazy guy, I kind of let my friend just talk. Because he was more upset than the crazy guy. You know, he'd been done wrong. I knew that. Anything that exists. Here's an example. This is my first ever skateboard deck. I don't think I have the wheels and trucks anymore. What is it made of? Wood. It is made of plywood. What is plywood made of? Molecules, carbon molecules. You know, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen molecules, basically all these complex proteins and stuff boil down to carbon, hydrogen, oxygen and different. What's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen? What are they? Here's the thing. The physics of quantum mechanics, and that's what I told the guy. I said to him, you don't know what that brick wall over there is. You don't know, like, I don't know what this wood is made out of. If you look down at the like atomic level, like, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. Like, I don't, and this is what my point to him, I was like, we don't know the full definition of anything. Even yourself especially. You know, or any physical object in existence, I don't know the full definition of like all of the properties of what it really is. Quantum mechanics still does not have a quantum theory of gravity. The only theory of gravity that we have is Einstein's theory of gravity. But if you work out how gravity works at the subatomic level, you get 1 divided by infinity, which is nonsense. No, I'm sorry. That was wrong. No, you get 1 divided by 0. Which is meaningless and logically impossible. So we know that Einstein's laws are wrong. But it's worse than that. You get 1 divided by an infinitely long string of zeros. Okay? And we have no quantum theory of even how gravity works. It's considered one of the biggest embarrassments to modern physics. But I still know that this door is here. I know some of the properties of this door without knowing all of the properties of this door. I know that if I pick up a concrete block and drop it on my foot, it will hurt. Does that mean that I know how quantum gravity works in that brick? No. Does that mean I have a full, complete definition of what that brick is? No. But that doesn't mean I don't know anything about the brick. Okay? So, hopefully you get the point. You don't have, nobody knows everything about anything. Except God, of course, right? Because God's a maximally great being. Alright, and so then what you do is you run into all these theological debates about the maximally great being. Like, for example, here's a debate that Thomas Aquinas had in the Middle Ages with the great William of Ockham, Occam's razor guy. And so Occam versus Aquinas, their theology debate, and this is theology debate. So, like, we know this maximally great being must exist, but then we debate back and forth, what can we tell about maximal greatness? And so there was this, like, okay, this debate. Does God's will take precedence, or does God's reason take precedence? So Aquinas said reason, and Occam said will. So, if I remember right, Occam was anti-nominalist, and Aquinas was a nominalist, which just means, like, blah blah. According to William of Ockham, God could will anything God wanted, and God's will took precedence over God's reason. And according to Aquinas, there are things that God can't will. So, like, God can't will anything that isn't in accordance with God's reason. It's difficult for us to talk about. It's not really that God wants to do it but can't, but that God just, God's reason, it takes precedence over God's will. And so there was this debate back and forth. Could God will, square triangles into existence, or could God, that's unreasonable. Well, God's will takes precedence over God's reason. The reason side won out. And in fact, Augustine, writing around 400 AD, one of his points from the Bible was that, okay, humans are made in the image of God, and animals are not. So, if we want to tell something that makes us, if we want to understand more about God, we look at the distinction between us and animals, and that could tell us something about what God is like. Whatever properties that are present in us that aren't present in animals. And one of the most obvious ones is what Augustine referred to as the indescribable blessing of the rational soul. That we have a mind, that we are rational creatures, and animals are not. He called the dumb animals, which sounds, really mean, but, like, understand that in older times that wasn't necessarily a mean word. When anything like dumb, you have to create a new word to make it not mean, and then that word becomes mean, so you have to create a new word 30 years later. So it's dumb, and then it's mentally retarded, and then it's mentally handicapped, and now it's like persons with, I don't know what, there's a new one now. And there'll be another one 30 years. That's just the way it has to work. But Augustine said, it's obvious, one of the obvious differences between us and animals is the ability to reason. And so he further deduced that, like, the way he put it was, far be it from God to not expect us to use reason in coming to God, because it is reason that God gave us to separate us from the animals and to be in His likeness. And you can see this idea of reason as it moves, from Augustine in 400 AD to Aquinas in 1200 AD. A different debate about reason was happening. And my point is theology is a Christian thing. In the Muslim world, it didn't go that way. There were these theological debates, and it was a similar debate early on in the Muslim world. It was similar to the early Christian debates about who is Jesus? Is Jesus God, or how I'm close to God? Jesus was pretty quickly, they had a pretty exalted view of Jesus, right there in the New Testament. But people were trying to squeak in different debates back and forth. And in Christianity, the debates continued, broke out into violence. The violence was abated. Debates can still continued until eventually they kept, when it comes to Jesus, they kept circling in until they debated back and forth until the debates were still even violent, but they were over increasingly small differences to where it was like very slight differences, and there's still violence. Even 200 years after the days of the Nicene Creed, there's still 200 years later, they would have thought, 100 years after the Nicene Creed, they would have thought, oh, that's old school stuff. Those dudes didn't know anything. That's like so vague, so much room for interpretation in the Nicene Creed. They took it further. Well, in the Muslim world, similar debates started, and instead of people being able to argue back and forth, a different thing happened. In the Christian world, you didn't really have one centralized government that could just stop violence and stop debate. But in the Muslim world, a certain guy came to power. The debates were about the Quran. And what they were saying was that the debate was this thing called Daweed, and is the Quran eternal or is the Quran created by God? And it was a big debate, very similar to is Jesus eternal or is Jesus created by God? It was very similar. Okay? And people argued back and forth, broke out into violence. Eventually, one guy just conquered everyone, and he was like, this is how it is, and it's a sin to ask why or question it. And he put a stop to debate, and he put a stop to theology itself. And so this is the key point. Theology in itself, careful reasoning about God. You can see how Augustine wanted us to use reason to understand God. The debates with Aquinas, the Trinity debate, and even this argument of theological theism. Well, I can't spell. Theology is a Christian thing. Careful reasoning about God. And you see, for example, in China, they thought they didn't believe in God. They had this so let's just boil it down. The rich and powerful people didn't believe in God. They had this Taoist or Confucianist or Buddhist, whatever, different things for different people. But the rich people had these atheist religions where they believed there was this impersonal essence behind everything. The common people just never bought into that. And when the common people would be Confucian, they would just import polytheism that they had always believed since the Bronze Age into Confucianism. So there's popular Confucianism, and then there's the people who came up with it, the rich smarty pants people, Confucianism. Same thing with Buddhism. Popular Buddhism is atheist. Popular Buddhism is polytheistic. Smarty pants people, Buddhism, atheist. Okay. But here's the point. The idea in China that you could do science and use your reason to figure out laws that help you understand how the world works was something that just never occurred to them because it was just been a joke to them. So China is fascinating. They invented the printing press 300 years before Europe did. In the 1100s, they had the printing press. What happened? Why didn't they take off? The printing press is considered the most important invention in the world because it allowed the communication and recording of knowledge. Sometimes Thomas Crapper's toilet is up there with it. But the printing press is a pretty important invention. Why didn't the Chinese invent the printing press? You know what they used it for? Poetry and recipes. What? Why didn't they use it for theology debates back and forth? Why didn't they use it for scientific journal articles so people could share their research, and for engineers and for inventors and for everything? Use it for cooking recipes. I'm not trying to blast cooking recipes, but there's a lot of stuff they're leaving out that's kind of important. Well, the problem was when China invented the printing press, Europe invented the university. Okay? Or it made its way to Europe from... It was in the process of inventing the university. universities spread across Europe through the second half of the Middle Ages, and like all instruction was in Latin, so professors could go from university. You got invited to another university if you had made a name for yourself by refuting classical knowledge. In Europe, the classical knowledge was basically old Greek ideas. So if you, basically Aristotle, if you could refute Aristotle's view of physics, then you were really respected. If you could defeat Aristotle, and you might get an invitation to another university, if you wanted to go, So they were institutions of higher learning, which means like going beyond what's already known, going higher. So they didn't have that in China. In China, they had these schools that were dedicated to mastering classic knowledge. Same thing happened in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, in China, they had their classic ancient philosophers, and it was like, they said, it was explicit, we want to never go beyond that. We want to never, getting away from that is just getting into error. That's their view. And in the Muslim world, they eventually embraced something similar with Greek views of physics. But in the Christian world, the problem is theology. If you don't think it's okay to reason about God, you might think it's not okay to reason about God's creation, to reason about the human body, to reason about medical science, to reason about other things. But if you think it's okay to reason about God, then you can use your reason about anything. And so when China is inventing, at the same time China invented the printing press, Europe invented the university. And the university didn't have printing presses, but they did pretty well. Okay? When the Portuguese sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, they realized that with 15 of their spare ships, they could just take over all trade on the Indian Ocean, and the Chinese couldn't do anything about it. Because the Chinese didn't have any cannons. They invented gunpowder back in the 1100s. They invented the compass. But what did they even experimented with building some cannons, and they were like, and they just used gunpowder for fireworks, for magic, and religious reasons. It didn't cross their minds to do guns. Okay, part of the problem was their religion. They didn't believe in theology and careful reasoning about God. That was a no-no. But at the same time, that was connected to, they always had a centralized political authority that could suppress new ideas that might disrupt the established order. Never existed in Europe. Theology continues. Debate continues. So when the gun comes to Europe, it's not long before the knights in shining armor are marching on the battlefield with thicker armor. Because the early guns didn't even have a handle. They were like this. And it was a wooden stick with a little barrel, and you just shove some rocks in there on top of the gunpowder, and you put light fire to it, boom, boom, and shoot rocks or some arrows, boom, gotcha, It's like a little crossbow. But then guns got better, where they had something called the arquebus, or the matchlock musket, where it was like a longer barrel, and you pack the actual musket ball in there. It didn't have a rifling or anything, and then there was just a long rope that was always burning, and you had like a bag of gunpowder on your side. It was very dangerous because you would just move the wick further up, and you'd pull it, and the wick would go whoop, and it would go into the gunpowder and light it. And so the guns got better, and when the guns got better, we still have in museums the last armor, the last medieval armor, and it's real thick, and there's bullet holes. Boop. No more of that. That was the end of that. Okay. But in China, they didn't have guns, they didn't have cannons. The Europeans, when they came over, didn't have the military might to just go to China and take it over. But they could just take over all trade on the ocean. So, again, my point is, all of this is connected to theology. And what we've been talking about in this video is a theological argument and just theological theism. And I'm trying to get you on the question of theology is a thing that Christians do. And it is a key to the strength of the West in general. I don't know if we should stop there. We could talk forever. It's So maybe we'll just stop there. But it's important for us to understand, let's just review. God is a maximally great being that must exist. And it's like, you just sort of know that the being of maximal greatness exists. A being of perfect goodness, of ultimate power must exist. That sort of thing. Anyway, there you go. Thank you for your time.